Welcome back to Telltale Books. I'm starting this video with a new series of mine where I'm going to be discussing more of an overview of authors. And I'm focusing at first on authors that I can quickly read a lot of really good representatives of their fiction, or in some cases read everything that I can get a hold of by them, and talk to you about the author's work and life in general, and in particular whether or not these authors would be of interest to you. And every author is of interest to somebody, but every author is not of interest to a lot of people. And that's what I'm attempting to do here, is to focus in on whether or not you should bother reading these authors. And I'm not going to say that by putting these authors down or severely criticizing their work. Rather, I'm going to tackle it in, this is what they did, this is the kind of thing they did. If you like this kind of thing, then this author is for you, and you should check them out. And most of these authors, and especially at the beginning, are going to be authors from far in the past, mostly science fiction, and people that are authors that are really very much forgotten by everyone. In many cases, even authors that maybe I've heard the name, but I never read anything by them, and I'm investigating them and checking them out so that I can come on here and report to you, is this someone for you? And the first one in this series, and there are certain authors I'm not going to bother doing that with, like Emily Bronte. I did a review of Wuthering Heights. Aside from that, she wrote some poetry. That's really it. So go to the review for Wuthering Heights. If you like what I'm saying there, check out Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. If you like that, maybe you want to try the poetry, move on. I don't need to do an overview video for Emily Bronte when I've pretty much covered everything she did. And I did talk, a lot of my videos, I do talk a lot about the author's biographies, at least at the time of the book they wrote. And some of the bigger, better known authors that wrote more works, it may be a little difficult to really do this kind of overview video. It's more, I think with them, it's more important to talk about where they were at the time each book or story was written. You know, like with Philip K. Dick, I'm going through story by story in order of publication. If you follow all those videos from start to finish, you'll get a really good idea of what Philip Dick was all about, and whether or not he's for you, and which ones are for you. You know, but some authors just doesn't pay to go into detail about everything they wrote, or even a lot of what they wrote. And that's the case with the first one that I have completed and am now prepared to talk about to you. His name is F Starzel. His full name was Roman Frederick Starzl, but he published as F Starzel. He lived from 1899 to 1976. He was a U.S. author. He published in the early science fiction magazines. I believe starting with Amazing Stories. Let me look that up, make sure I'm accurate. I'm going to my website where I have a, Starzl is a little difficult because I couldn't find a really complete bibliography of his work. He wrote a lot more than just science fiction, but I could only find a bibliography of his science fiction stories, so that's all I read. And I read everything that I could easily get a hold of without paying hundreds or thousands of dollars for ancient pulp magazines. Okay, so his very first story was published in Amazing Stories Quarterly in the summer of 1928. It was called Out of the Sub-Universe. And he wrote, that was published in July of 1928. And he wrote maybe 20 stories between 1928 and 1935. Most of those stories are available in PDFs of the old magazines. I have not been able to find any information about any kind of collection of Starzl's stories. And I don't know of any novels that he has written. The longest he's written, I think, is a novelette. So most of his stories were short. Most of them I was able to find for free in online PDFs of the old pulp magazines. Thank you, whoever scans all those in and archives them. That's a great service to people who really want to dig into an author like this that just isn't in print. I did find an ebook that had, I think, 4 of Starzl's stories, but that wasn't enough for me. I wanted to dig in a lot more. Starzl mostly wrote stories that were related to what he called the interplanetary flying police. The vast majority of his science fiction falls into that series, and it's a loose series. You don't have to read it in order. And I don't really love that name, Interplanetary Flying Police. You don't really fly in space. But it is what it is. These are mostly space operas. Most of these interplanetary flying police stories are kind of like mystery stories where you have one of the police officers stumbles upon some kind of wrongdoing, something's not right, and they start looking into it and they find that there's somebody involved in some kind of criminal enterprise. And so then that policeman has to try to put a stop to this person. Sometimes they have access to bringing in more of their fellow IFP officers. Other times they're in a situation where they're all on their own. But these are really very excellent stories for their time and for what they are. They're space opera. They're set in the solar system. They don't go out beyond the solar system. He doesn't get too daring with his ideas, but there's a lot of imagination. There's a fair amount of adventure, and there are fun reads. I found them to be very enjoyable. So the interesting thing about Starzl, aside from the fact that these are early space opera, fairly simple, fairly short, and but they do have some good imagination to them. They are fairly well written, some interesting characters, although a little bit stock. But there is a rich imagination here, and they are pretty well written. One in particular, it reminded me a lot of A Martian Odyssey. It didn't take place on Mars. It took place on an imaginary planet inside the orbit of Mercury. And the ending of the story, they had to battle some space pirates that were hiding out there. But the planet had a jungle type of ecosystem on it. Never mind that this would be impossible for something inside the orbit of Mercury. These people crash there, and they have to travel through it. And there are all kinds of monsters, killer plants, deadly monsters that they have to deal with in traveling across this planet to get to where they need to go. And it had very much a feel of A Martian Odyssey by Weinbaum, which wasn't published until 1934. This story was published in 1930 in Astounding Stories for August of 1930, well before Weinbaum ever started publishing. And Starzl wrote a story that reminded me very much of A Martian Odyssey. It also reminded me a lot of Death World by Harry Harrison. It was a very, very good story. So there are some gems to be found in Starzl's science fiction output. And then, like I say, he wrote other types of stories for other pulp magazines. I could not for the life of me find any bibliography or even information on one of those stories, but he was supposed to have published in other genres. So he wrote more than just his science fiction stories. You're not going to find, as I said earlier, you're not going to find a book of F Starzel. There is an e-book that collects a small number of his stories, but you're not going to find most of his work in a print, and you're definitely not going to find a printed collection of any of his work. To get his work, you have to go back to those original magazines, and like I say, the easiest thing to do if you're interested is find the PDFs online of the magazines where he is in and read them for yourself there. He published in Astounding, he published in Amazing, he published in Wonder Stories, but he stopped publishing shortly after Weinbaum started publishing. Which is interesting because, like I say, he reminds me so much of Weinbaum. The reason he stopped publishing is that his family owned a newspaper business in his hometown. And in about 1935, he had to take over the family newspaper business. When that happened, when he had to completely be in charge of that newspaper business, he stopped writing. To the best of my knowledge, he did not write any science fiction or other genre pulp fiction after that. He just dropped out of sight. And he lived all the way until 1976. And all those years, from 1935 to 1976, he had been away from the genre and been away from writing fiction. Which is sad because, kind of like Weinbaum, if Weinbaum would have lived, the promise seems like it could have led to so much more. Starzl did live, but he just didn't write. But here again, the promise seems like it could have led to so much more for him. But what is out there, what he did write, while it is interesting, it's probably only interesting to someone like me that has a fascination with the history of science fiction and loves those early stories and is willing to forgive the ways in which they don't live up to our expectations today, really. I take a lot of things with those old stories with a grain of salt and just enjoy the story for what it is and don't expect it to live up to Tchaikovsky's Children of Time or Brandon Sanderson's Way of Kings. I just enjoy it for what it is. And that's, if you're interested in looking up Starzl, if you like older science fiction, if you like space opera, he's worth looking into it. He's worth learning a bit about and reading some of his stories. I enjoyed it. I really had a good time reading what little I could get a hold of. So that's one down, and probably 500 more to go. I'm going to continue doing these with any authors that I feel I've read enough that I can really talk intelligently about their whole career. I'm going to do these overviews. And like I say, with some of the bigger authors with a lot more stories, I may just skip it and just let you go to the individual stories and novels. We'll see. Till next time, like us and subscribe to us and come back for more and leave comments. Definitely leave comments. We want to hear what you have to say. Leave comments. And as soon as I'm ready, I will do another of these author overviews. I've already found another one from very early science fiction and read two of his stories and was blown away by one of them. And so that'll be coming probably later in September.